In the summer of 2020, a company that had been building firearms without interruption since 1816 stopped existing. Not slowed down, not sold, stopped. Its factories were split into pieces and auctioned to buyers who had never worked together before. Its ammunition line went to one company, its rifle plant went to another, its most famous handgun brand went to a third. The name that had been stamped into American gun cabinets for 2 centuries was, legally, gone. And right now, in a squad car in Ohio, in a duck blind in Arkansas, in a gun store rack in a town you've never heard of, a Remington 870 pump shotgun is doing exactly what it was built to do in 1950. Nobody told the gun the company died. This is not a story about a company that survived everything. It's the opposite. It's a story about a company that eventually didn't survive, and a product that outran its own maker anyway. To understand how that happens, you have to go back to a rifle shooting contest in upstate New York in 1816, where the man who started all of this came in second place. Eliphalet Remington II was 22 years old, and he needed a rifle barrel for a local shooting match. Rather than buy one from an established gunsmith, he decided to forge it himself at his father's blacksmith shop near Ilion, New York, then walk it 8 miles to the nearest gunsmith to have it rifled and fitted to a stock. He entered the match, he lost, another shooter beat him. That should be the end of the story. It isn't, because of what happened after the match, not during it. The other competitors had watched him shoot, and more importantly, they'd watched the barrel perform. A young blacksmith's hand-forged barrel had kept pace with weapons built by trained gunsmiths. Before Eliphalet left the grounds that day, he had orders. Not for himself, for barrels. Other men wanted what he'd made, even though the man who'd made it had lost. That's the entire founding story of what would become the oldest gunmaker in America, and it tells you something about the company before it tells you anything else. Remington didn't start with a triumph. It started with a product good enough to outlast a defeat. The origin isn't a legend about the founder's genius. It's a testimonial from strangers who beat him and still wanted what he'd built. Over the next few years, demand for Eliphalet's barrels grew steadily enough that barrel making stopped being a sideline to the family's blacksmithing and became the business itself. By the late 1820s, he was manufacturing complete rifles, not just barrels, working out of the same small operation on the Mohawk River that his father had run before him. The location mattered more than it looks like it should. Ilion sat on the Erie Canal, which meant a small upstate workshop had a direct water route to raw materials coming in and finished goods going out. Without that canal, Remington is a regional blacksmith story that never leaves the county. With it, Eliphalet had a supply chain that could scale. In 1828, the operation relocated permanently to Ilion. That's not a footnote. 200 years later, Remington's main manufacturing site was still standing on essentially that same ground, which makes it, by a wide margin, the longest-running firearms manufacturing site in continuous American use. Companies move. Companies get bought and relocated to cheaper states, cheaper labor, cheaper land. Remington's home address barely changed for 2 centuries. That kind of geographic permanence sounds unremarkable until you compare it to almost every other business in this industry, most of which changed states, changed owners, or changed names entirely at least once a generation. Ilion just kept making guns. By the middle of the 19th century, Remington wasn't just a rifle maker. It was becoming a serious industrial operation, and the weapon that proved it was the rolling block rifle. The mechanism was almost aggressively simple. A breech block rotated back to expose the chamber, the shooter loaded a cartridge, and the block rotated forward to seal it before firing. No complicated linkage, few parts to break, and strong enough to handle the more powerful metallic cartridges coming into use after the Civil War. It wasn't flashy engineering, it was dependable engineering, which turned out to matter more. What set the rolling block apart commercially wasn't the U.S. military. Remington never became the primary American service rifle contractor the way Colt or Springfield did. What set it apart was everyone else's military. Foreign governments across Europe, Latin America, and parts of Asia adopted the rolling block for their own armies over the following decades, in numbers that reportedly reached into the millions of units when every contract and variant is counted. Remington built a global export business on a rifle its own country never fully standardized on. There's a pattern worth naming here, because it recurs through the rest of this company's history. While competitors up the road were fighting over the prestige of a single flagship U.S. Army contract, the kind of deal that makes headlines and looks good in a shareholder letter, Remington was quietly building something less glamorous and more durable, a reputation for reliability that didn't depend on any one government's budget or any one war's timeline. Civilian trust, foreign contracts, sporting demand, a wider, less dramatic foundation. That instinct, spread the bet, don't chase the single big contract, is going to matter again later in this story, in a business Remington entered that had nothing to do with firearms at all. Here's a fact that gets left out of almost every gun history video, probably because it sounds made up. The company that made your grandfather's shotgun also built the machine his secretary typed on. In the early 1870s, two inventors named Christopher Scholes and Carlos Glidden had developed a working typewriter design but lacked the manufacturing capacity to produce it at any real scale. They needed a company with precision metalworking experience, tooling, and factory capacity sitting mostly idle in peacetime. Remington, a gunmaker with exactly that kind of idle capacity between periods of heavy military demand, took on the contract and, beginning in 1873, built what became known as the Scholes and Glidden typewriter, later marketed simply as the Remington typewriter. Think about what that decision actually was. A firearms manufacturer looked at the boom and bust rhythm of gun demand, huge during wars, thin during peace, and decided the solution wasn't to wait out the slow years. It was to build something else on the same machines for a market that didn't rise and fall with military budgets. That's the same logic Beretta would apply to sporting shotguns 60 years later, and the same logic gun industry historians still point to today as smart diversification. Remington got there first, and got there almost by accident, solving someone else's manufacturing problem. The typewriter business grew into its own substantial operation, successful enough, in fact, that it eventually became a liability of a different kind. In 1886, facing financial strain in the firearms side of the business, Remington's ownership sold the typewriter division outright to a group of investors, who ran it independently under new ownership. The gun business and the typewriter business, which had shared a factory floor and a founder's name for over a decade, were formally split apart. That split is worth remembering, because it's not a footnote to the Remington story, it's the first draft of the ending. A century and a half before the 2020 bankruptcy scattered Remington's assets to separate buyers, the company had already demonstrated exactly what would eventually happen to it again. Build something valuable enough, and eventually somebody separates it from the name that built it. Everything up to this point in the story is prologue. This chapter is the actual product this documentary is named for, and it did not arrive on the first attempt. It didn't arrive on the second or third either. The first attempt was the Model 10, designed by engineer John Pedersen and introduced in 1908, a hammerless pump shotgun that ejected spent shells from the bottom rather than the side, an unusual and clever design for its time. It sold reasonably well and served for years, but it had a structural weakness under hard, repeated use. Parts of the action were more fragile than the rugged, all-weather reputation the company wanted to build its shotgun line around. The second attempt came less than a decade later. The Model 17, introduced around 1917, drew on design work associated with John Browning's patents and represented a real mechanical improvement. But its most lasting legacy wasn't even under the Remington name. The Model 17's design was later licensed and adapted by Ithaca Gun Company into their own Model 37, which became a long-running competitor in its own right. Remington had built a good gun and effectively handed part of its value to someone else's product line. The third attempt was the Model 31, launched in 1931. This one was genuinely well-engineered, smooth cycling, well-balanced, respected by the shooters who owned one. It simply couldn't outcompete Winchester's Model 12, which had a head start in the market and a reputation that was already locked in with hunters and law enforcement. Good engineering isn't always enough to unseat an incumbent. 3 shotguns. 3 real distinct attempts, each with a specific documented flaw or disadvantage, not marketing failures, mechanical or competitive ones. And then, in 1950, Remington's engineers released the Model 870 Wingmaster. What made the 870 different wasn't one dramatic innovation, it was the absence of the specific problems that had limited the previous 3. The receiver was machined from solid steel bar stock rather than built from a more failure-prone assembly, which made it extraordinarily durable under repeated hard cycling. It was simpler to manufacture than its predecessors, which kept the price accessible to an ordinary hunter rather than a specialist. And it cycled reliably in mud, cold, and neglect, the exact conditions a working shotgun actually lives in as opposed to a showroom. It was not the most sophisticated shotgun Remington had ever designed. It was the one that finally stopped breaking, stopped losing to Winchester, and stopped needing to be licensed out to a competitor to find its market. By the time production numbers were being counted in the millions of units, The 870 had become one of the best-selling shotguns in American history, a title it still holds today, more than 70 years and 3 failed predecessors later. That's the shape of this chapter's lesson, and it's worth stating plainly instead of letting it just sit in the background. Sometimes the product that becomes a legend isn't the company's most ambitious idea. It's the 4th attempt at solving the same boring problem, finally solved boring enough to work. When the First World War reached American industry, Remington's factory capacity became a national asset almost overnight. The company expanded production dramatically to manufacture rifles under contract, including, at a dedicated wartime facility built specifically for the purpose, large volumes of the pattern rifle the British government needed and, separately, rifles built to Russian specification before that contract collapsed with the Russian Revolution. It was the same instinct as the typewriter deal decades earlier: idle capacity, repurposed fast, for whoever needed it most urgently. When the war ended, Remington did what it had always done. It didn't try to hold on to wartime scale artificially. It scaled back down and returned its attention to the products that had built the company's civilian reputation in the first place. In the decades that followed, 2 products in particular became the twin pillars of that civilian identity: the 870 shotgun, already discussed, and the Model 700 bolt-action rifle, introduced in 1962, which became one of the most widely used hunting and precision rifles in the American market, respected enough that it also found its way into law enforcement and military sniper use over the following decades. Together, these 2 guns earned Remington a nickname that tells you exactly how the brand was positioned in the American mind: Big Green, after the green cardboard ammunition boxes and packaging the company used for decades. Not glamorous. Not mythologized the way a Colt revolver got mythologized in Western films, and not positioned as aristocratic sporting equipment the way a premium European shotgun brand might be marketed. Big Green meant dependable, ordinary, everywhere. The gun in the closet, the gun the hardware store carried, the gun your father owned because it was simply what you bought. That unglamorous positioning is exactly what made Remington's eventual collapse land so strangely for an entire generation of American gun owners. Because a company that specifically built its identity on being the reliable, unremarkable, always-there option is not supposed to be the one that goes bankrupt. By the early 2000s, Remington's ownership structure had changed in a way that would become familiar to anyone who has followed how private equity handles legacy manufacturers. The company was acquired and loaded with the kind of debt that assumes future revenue will always be there to service it. A structural bet that worked fine as long as sales stayed strong, and became dangerous the moment they didn't. Sales pressure arrived from more than one direction at once. Firearms demand is famously cyclical, driven by political anxiety about future regulation as much as by ordinary consumer interest, and that cycle didn't cooperate with a debt structure that needed steady, predictable revenue. Then, in December 2012, a gunman used a Bushmaster brand rifle, a brand Remington's parent company owned, in the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting in Newtown, Connecticut.
The Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting have agreed to a landmark $73 million settlement with a gun manufacturer. Their lawsuit was against the company that made the rifle that killed.
Families of the victims eventually pursued a lawsuit against Remington's parent company, arguing the marketing of that rifle line violated Connecticut consumer protection law. The case worked its way through the courts for years, reaching the Connecticut Supreme Court and eventually the U.S. Supreme Court, which declined to block the suit from proceeding to trial. That legal exposure landed on top of an already debt-strained company. In March 2018, Remington's parent entity filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy for the first time, restructuring roughly $1 billion in debt. It didn't fix the underlying problem. In July 2020, the company filed for bankruptcy a second time. This time, there was no restructuring that kept the whole company intact. The assets were broken apart and auctioned in pieces to separate buyers who had no prior relationship to one another. The ammunition operation went to one purchaser. The firearms manufacturing assets, including the Eliphalet factory itself, went to a different buyer. Other individual brands were split off to yet other companies entirely. A firearms company that had operated continuously under one roof in one town since 1816, through the Civil War, through 2 World Wars, through the typewriter years, through the Depression, legally ceased to exist as a single entity in the summer of 2020. 204 years of continuous operation, and then it was gone, not because a competitor beat it, but because a financial structure built on top of it eventually collapsed under its own weight. Here's what happened to the pieces. The Eliphalet firearms manufacturing operation was acquired by a new ownership group that reorganized it under the name Arms, and resumed production of Remington's core firearms lines, including the 870, under license to continue using the Remington name on the products themselves. The ammunition business was purchased separately and continues operating under its own ownership as Remington Ammunition. Other individual product lines, including the historic Marlin rifle brand Remington had owned for years, were split off to yet another buyer entirely. The company Eliphalet Remington, built in a blacksmith shop after losing a shooting match, no longer exists as the single continuous entity it had been for 2 centuries. What exists now is a set of separately owned businesses, each holding a fragment of what used to be one company, each still permitted to put the Remington name on what they make. And the 870 is still one of them, still in production, still sold in the same gun store racks, still carried by the same police departments, still handed down in the same families that have owned one for 3 generations. The specific legal entity that designed it in 1950, after 3 failed attempts, does not exist anymore. The shotgun does not know that, and neither does the customer buying one this week. That's the actual shape of this story, and it's a different shape than the survival against all odds version this channel and others usually tell about old gun companies. Remington didn't outlast every empire around it the way some 5-century arms dynasties have. It built something so good, so dependable, so deeply embedded in ordinary American life, that when the company itself finally failed, after 2 centuries, 2 world wars, a lawsuit tied to the worst kind of tragedy, and a debt structure that finally caught up with it, the product it built kept selling anyway, under new owners who had never made a single decision that built it. The company died. The gun didn't.